This story will leave you speechless. A woman drives desperately through a storm, her hands trembling on the steering wheel, a mysterious envelope on the seat beside her. The rain pours down relentlessly, the night is dark, and something is terribly wrong. She keeps glancing at the road, but her mind is elsewhere, on a secret she can no longer keep. And then the crash. Metal twists, glass shatters, and silence falls over the highway. When the girl wakes up, she has lost everything she ever knew. And what awaits her is even more terrifying. A man she barely knows takes her into his home. And as the days pass, unsettling questions arise. Why is her name on documents that don't belong to her? Why does everyone in town look at her with pity or suspicion? And most importantly, what was her mother trying to tell her before it was too late? The truth is darker than she ever imagined. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment below. What do you think is hidden behind this mystery? Who can be trusted? Let's find out together. Now, let's begin the story. The rain hit the windshield like a barrage of needles, each drop hammering against the glass as the tires skidded slightly on the slick road. Margaret Carter's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Her heart pounded erratically, her breath coming in sharp, panicked bursts. The headlights barely cut through the dense sheets of rain, and her vision blurred as she kept glancing at the worn envelope on the passenger seat. That cursed envelope. The thing she had spent the last 13 years trying to forget. She shouldn't have opened it. She should have left the past buried where it belonged. But now it was too late. Her daughter, Emily, sat beside her, small and silent, her wide eyes flicking between her mother's face and the storm outside. She could sense it, even though Margaret had tried to keep her voice steady, even though she had forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes before they left the house. Emily knew something was wrong. She always did. "Mom, slow down." Her voice was barely audible over the howling wind, but Margaret didn't respond. Her mind was racing too fast, tangled in fear, regret, and a terrible certainty that they were running out of time. Her phone vibrated on the dashboard. Another message, another warning. She didn't dare pick it up. She already knew what it would say. And then it happened. The flash of headlights, too close, too sudden. The roar of an 18-wheeler cutting through the storm, veering into her lane. She gasped, wrenching the wheel, the car fishtailing as the tires lost their grip. Emily screamed. The world turned upside down. The sound of metal scraping against metal, of shattering glass, of her own breath being ripped from her lungs. And then nothing. Darkness swallowed her whole. Margaret's eyes fluttered open to the distant wail of sirens. Her vision swam, the world shifting in and out of focus as raindrops streaked across her face. Pain bloomed across her body, sharp and searing, but none of it mattered. Emily. She turned her head, her pulse a frantic drumbeat against her skull. The passenger seat was empty. Panic surged through her veins, stronger than the agony of her broken body. She tried to move, tried to scream, but the words stuck in her throat, thick with blood and desperation. And then footsteps. A shadow loomed over her, blocking the dim glow of the streetlights. A man. His face was obscured by the rain, but she could see the outline of his shoulders, the shape of his hands as they reached down toward her. "Emily," she croaked, barely a whisper. "Where is she?" But the man didn't answer. He simply picked up the envelope from the passenger seat, glanced at it, and then slipped it into his pocket. The darkness swallowed her again. When Emily awoke, she was in a hospital bed. The sterile white walls, the beeping of machines, the too bright fluorescent lights. It all felt distant, like a dream she couldn't wake up from. Her head ached. Her body felt too heavy, too numb. She turned her head slowly, expecting to see her mother, to hear her voice reassuring her that everything was okay. But the chair beside her bed was empty. A nurse entered, her expression carefully neutral. Too neutral. "Emily, sweetheart, you're awake. That's good. How are you feeling?" Emily's throat was dry, her voice barely a whisper. "Where's my mom?" The nurse hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. But Emily saw it. She felt it. Her heart clenched, cold dread washing over her like ice water. "Sweetheart," the nurse's voice softened. "I'm so sorry." Emily couldn't breathe. The world tilted, her vision swam, and the only thing she could hear was the deafening roar of silence. Margaret was gone. The funeral was small, too small. The rain hadn't stopped since that night, and the entire town seemed wrapped in an eerie, suffocating gloom. Emily stood in front of the grave, her fingers curled into tight fists, her nails digging into her palms. She didn't cry. She couldn't. People spoke in hushed voices around her, whispers that weren't meant to be heard but still reached her ears. "Poor girl. All alone now. Did you hear? They're sending her to live with Richard Carter. That old man? The one who—" "Hush. She's right there." Emily's head snapped up. Richard Carter. The name was familiar, but only vaguely. Her mother had mentioned him before, but never in detail. Always in passing. Always with something unspoken hanging in the air. She turned, her gaze landing on a man standing apart from the crowd. Tall, broad-shouldered, with graying hair and eyes that seemed older than the rest of him. He wasn't crying. He wasn't speaking. He just stood there watching her. Their eyes met, and for a brief, fleeting moment, Emily saw something there. Something that made her stomach twist. Regret. Guilt. Something else she couldn't quite name. "Emily." The voice came from behind her. A woman, someone from child services, she assumed. She barely remembered the meeting, the paperwork, the explanations that sounded more like excuses. "You're going to be living with Mr. Carter now," the woman said, her tone soft, as if she expected Emily to break apart at any second. Emily didn't respond. She just looked at Richard again. He didn't move, didn't say a word, but she swore, just for a second, she saw his hands tremble. The house was nothing like she expected. Large, old, filled with shadows that stretched too long in the dim light. The air smelled of dust and something else. Something she couldn't quite place. The moment she stepped inside, she knew something was wrong. Richard led her through the hallways in silence, his footsteps slow and deliberate. There were locked doors, too many of them, and every time Emily asked a question, he avoided it. Her mother's name was never spoken. That night, as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, she heard it. A whisper, not words, just a sound, a breath, presence. She turned, her pulse hammering, but the room was empty, or at least it looked that way. The nightmares started that night. Memories she didn't recognize, faces she'd never seen, and a name she didn't remember ever hearing. Alejandro. She woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, her heart thundering against her ribs. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch, creeping closer, suffocating. And then footsteps, slow, heavy, coming from the hallway. She held her breath. The handle of her door rattled. Emily's blood turned to ice. She squeezed her eyes shut, pulling the blanket over her head, her body trembling. The footsteps stopped. Silence. And then, just as she thought it was over, the whisper came again. Closer this time. Too close. Her heart nearly stopped when she finally recognized the voice. Richard. And he was standing right outside her door. Emily lay frozen beneath the heavy blanket, every muscle in her body tense as she listened to the silence outside her door. Her breath was shallow, controlled, measured. She strained her ears, trying to distinguish between the sounds of the old house settling and the presence she was certain was lurking just outside. The rattling of the door handle had been real. She hadn't imagined it. She knew that much. But now there was nothing, just the heavy weight of uncertainty pressing against her chest. Her fingers curled tightly around the edge of the blanket, her pulse hammering so loudly she swore it would betray her. Seconds stretched into minutes, each one more agonizing than the last. And then footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving away from her door, back down the hallway. The old wooden floor creaked under the weight of each step. Emily remained still, waiting, listening. She counted each step until the sound faded into nothingness. Only then did she dare to breathe. She threw the blanket off her face, her eyes darting toward the door. The dim glow from the hallway nightlight barely seeped through the narrow gap at the bottom. A shadow passed by just for a second. Then it was gone. Was Richard checking on her? So why hadn't he just knocked? Why had he lingered outside her door like that? Why had he tried the handle? A shiver ran down her spine. Something wasn't right. She turned onto her side, curling her knees toward her chest, clutching the blanket as if it could somehow shield her from the creeping sense of dread pressing down on her. Sleep felt impossible now. Her mind raced, tangled with memories she didn't recognize, nightmares she couldn't escape, and questions that had no answers. Alejandro. The name had echoed in her dreams, but she had no idea why. It was unfamiliar, foreign on her tongue, and yet it felt significant, like a puzzle piece she was meant to find. She forced herself to close her eyes, inhaling deeply, trying to steady her pulse. Whatever was happening, whatever Richard was hiding, she would find out. Morning came too soon. The pale light filtered through the thick curtains, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Emily's body ached from the tension of the night before, and exhaustion clung to her like a second skin. For a moment, she lay still, listening. The house was eerily quiet. Too quiet. She pushed back the blankets and sat up, her gaze flicking toward the door. It was still closed. She hesitated before stepping out of bed, the floor cold beneath her bare feet. Slowly, cautiously, she approached the door. She hesitated for just a second before reaching for the handle, half expecting it to be locked. It wasn't. She turned it gently, pulling the door open just enough to peek out. The hallway was empty. Taking a breath, she stepped out, moving carefully as she made her way toward the staircase. The scent of coffee lingered in the air, mixed with something else, something slightly metallic. The house was old. The wood creaked beneath her weight, but the silence was still deafening. Richard was in the kitchen. She saw him through the doorway, standing by the counter, his back to her. He was stirring a cup of coffee, but his movements were slow, almost mechanical. His posture was rigid, shoulders tense. For a moment, she considered turning back, retreating to her room until she could figure out what to say. But something inside her refused to shrink away. "Morning," she said, her voice careful but firm. Richard turned his head slightly but didn't fully face her. "Morning." Emily hesitated in the doorway, watching him closely. He looked tired. No, more than tired. Worn down, as if he hadn't slept in days. There were dark circles under his eyes, the lines on his face deeper than she remembered from the funeral. She stepped forward. "Were you outside my room last night?" He finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Why do you ask?" Her pulse quickened. That wasn't a denial. "I thought I heard something," she said carefully, watching his reaction. Richard studied her for a moment, then took a slow sip of his coffee. "This house makes noises at night. You'll get used to it." That wasn't an answer either. Emily clenched her fists, a sharp frustration bubbling up inside her. Every interaction with him felt like running into a brick wall. He was keeping something from her, several things probably, and she was tired of pretending not to notice. She sat down at the table, crossing her arms. "Who's Alejandro?" Richard visibly stiffened. It was subtle, just a brief tightening of his jaw, but she saw it. His grip on the coffee mug tightened slightly, his knuckles turning pale. For a moment, she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Where did you hear that name?" Emily's throat felt dry. I don't know. I keep dreaming about it." Something flickered in Richard's eyes, something she couldn't quite place. Fear? Regret? Anger? He set the coffee cup down with deliberate care. "Forget that name." Her stomach twisted. "Why?" Richard looked at her then, really looked at her. His eyes were dark, unreadable. "Because it doesn't matter anymore." The finality in his tone sent a shiver through her. But he was wrong. It did matter. She just didn't know why yet. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Richard barely spoke to her, retreating to his office for most of the afternoon. Emily wandered through the house, taking in the dusty furniture, the locked doors, the faint scent of something old lingering in the air. She felt like a stranger in this place, like an intruder in someone else's life. By evening, she couldn't take it anymore. She needed answers. So, she started searching. She moved carefully, quietly, checking drawers, shelves, anywhere Richard might have hidden something important. But it was the study that caught her attention. The door was locked, of course. But when she checked above the doorframe, her fingers brushed against a small, cold key. Her heart pounded as she inserted it into the lock, twisting slowly. The door creaked open. Inside, the air was heavy, stale. Bookshelves lined the walls, stacked with old leather-bound volumes and papers that looked untouched for years. The desk was covered in neatly arranged documents, but it was the photograph on the wall that stopped her cold. It was of her mother, younger, smiling, standing next to Richard. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Richard had known her mother, not just in passing, not just as some distant family acquaintance. They had been close, and he had never said a word. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the frame, but before she could touch it, Emily, her blood ran cold. She turned slowly. Richard was standing in the doorway, his face unreadable, his hands clenched at his sides. "You shouldn't be in here." Her mouth went dry. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. Richard's jaw tightened. "Tell you what?" Her eyes burned. "That you knew my mother." Silence. Then, finally, Richard exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly. "Because," he said, his voice hollow, "I knew you'd start asking questions." Emily swallowed hard, her chest tight. "And why is that a bad thing?" Richard looked at her then, his expression unreadable. "Because, Emily," he said quietly, "some questions don't have answers you want to hear." She felt her stomach twist, dread curling around her ribs like a vice. But it was too late to stop now. She needed to know, even if the truth destroyed her. Emily stared at Richard, her pulse pounding so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. The study felt smaller now, the walls pressing in, the air too thick to breathe. Her fingers clenched the edge of the desk as she tried to steady herself, but the weight of his words sat heavy in her chest. Some questions don't have answers you want to hear. She had spent the last few days drowning in questions, in half-truths, in whispers that never became full explanations. But she was done waiting for Richard to decide when she deserved the truth. She lifted the framed photograph of her mother, her fingers trembling slightly as she held it up. "You lied to me." Richard's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "I didn't lie." Emily's throat burned. "You said my mom never talked about you, that you were just someone from her past. But this," she gestured to the photograph, her voice rising, "this isn't just someone from her past. You knew her. You were close. So why didn't you tell me?" Richard exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging slightly, as if the weight of this conversation had finally pressed down on him. He took a step forward, but Emily instinctively moved back. His expression flickered with something. Pain? Guilt? She couldn't tell. "I knew your mother," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "A long time ago." Emily's hands clenched around the frame. "Then why did she never mention you?" Richard hesitated, a fraction of a second too long. Emily caught it. "You don't want to know," he finally said. Her grip on the frame tightened. "Yes, I do." He sighed, running a hand over his face before looking at her with something unreadable in his eyes. "Your mother and we had a complicated past. I cared about her, more than you know. But things," he stopped, shaking his head. "Things got in the way." Emily narrowed her eyes. "What things?" Richard didn't answer, and that silence told her more than any words could. She took a deep breath, trying to push down the frustration rising in her chest. "Did she know?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard frowned. "Know what?" Emily swallowed hard. "That you were still here, that you were alive, that you—" She hesitated, forcing herself to ask the question she had been too afraid to ask until now. "Did she leave on purpose?" Richard's face darkened, and that hesitation, just a brief flicker, was all the confirmation she needed. Her stomach twisted painfully. She set the photo down with deliberate care, her hands shaking as she stepped back. "I can't believe this," she whispered. "You're hiding something. You're still hiding something." Richard's expression hardened. "Emily," but she was already turning, already moving toward the door, because she knew if she stayed there a second longer, she would scream. She didn't stop walking, not as she stepped into the hallway, not as she passed the locked doors that had become a symbol of everything Richard refused to tell her, not as she reached the stairs and ran down, her feet barely touching the wood. She needed air. She needed to get out of that house. She grabbed her coat from the hook by the door, shoving her arms through the sleeves as she reached for the doorknob. And then, click, Emily froze. The door was locked. Her heart pounded as she twisted the knob again. It didn't budge. Panic curled in her chest like a tightening fist. "Richard!" She spun around, her voice sharp, cutting through the silence. "Why is the door locked?" No answer. "Richard!" Still nothing. She stormed back down the hallway, her breath quick and uneven. When she reached the study, she threw the door open, but it was empty. The photograph she had set down was gone. Her stomach lurched. Something wasn't right. She turned on her heel, moving quickly now, heading toward the back of the house. She reached the kitchen door, grabbing the handle. Locked. The windows. Locked. Every single exit. Her pulse roared in her ears. Something was very, very wrong. And then footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Coming from upstairs. Emily's breath caught in her throat. "Richard." She forced herself to move, backtracking through the house, her mind racing for a plan. She needed a phone. Her phone. It was upstairs in her room. But so was Richard. She hesitated for only a second before making her decision. The study. There was a landline there. She had seen it on the desk. She rushed back, her fingers fumbling as she grabbed the receiver, her heart pounding. She pressed it to her ear. Silence. The line was dead. Emily slammed it down, a cold sweat breaking out across her skin. And then, a voice. Soft, almost a whisper. "Emily." Her body went rigid. She turned slowly, every inch of her screaming to run. Richard stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't have gone through my things," he said quietly. Emily's throat tightened. "Why is the door locked?" Richard didn't answer right away. He took a slow step forward. "Because I can't let you leave yet." Her chest tightened. "What does that mean?" He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "It means you need to stop asking questions. For your own good." Emily took a step back, her body trembling. "What are you hiding?" Richard's expression flickered with something she couldn't place. Then finally, everything. Her breath hitched. Silence stretched between them, thick, suffocating. Then, a knock at the door. Emily's head snapped toward the sound. Richard tensed. Another knock, louder this time. Emily's pulse roared. She turned back to Richard, her voice barely a whisper. "Who is that?" His jaw clenched. The knocking came again. And then, a voice. Deep, unfamiliar. "Emily Carter?" Her stomach dropped. Richard's eyes darkened. And for the first time since she had arrived in this house, she saw something in him she had never seen before. Fear. She took a step toward the door. Richard's voice was sharp. "Emily, don't." Her breath hitched. The knocking turned into pounding. The voice outside was insistent. "Emily Carter, open the door. I know you're in there." Richard moved fast. Faster than she thought he could. His hand gripped her wrist, firm, unrelenting. "Listen to me," he said urgently. "You can't answer that door." Emily's body stiffened. "Why?" Richard's eyes burned into hers. "Because if you do," he said slowly, "you'll never get the chance to ask me another question again." Her blood turned to ice. Silence hung between them, charged, waiting. Then, another voice. A name. A name Emily had only heard in her nightmares. "Emily." A pause. And then, "It's Alejandro." Emily's entire world tilted. The floor felt unsteady beneath her feet. Alejandro. The name she had whispered in her sleep. The name that had haunted her. The name that Richard had told her to forget. And now, it was standing right outside the door. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts. Richard's grip on her wrist tightened. "Don't open it," he whispered. But Emily wasn't sure she had a choice anymore. She had to know. She had to find out, even if it destroyed her. Emily's body remained frozen, every muscle locked in place as if her bones had turned to ice. The pounding on the door echoed through the old house, each knock a sharp blade against her already frayed nerves. Her breath came in short, quick gasps, her heartbeat hammering in her ears like a war drum. The voice outside had been unmistakable. Alejandro, the name she had whispered in her sleep, the name that had haunted her nightmares, the name Richard had warned her to forget. And now it was here, outside the door, calling for her. Richard's grip on her wrist tightened just enough to make her flinch. "Emily." His voice was urgent, low, edged with something she had never heard before. Panic. "Don't answer it." Her throat felt dry, her fingers trembling as she stared at the wooden door that separated her from the man outside. "Who is he?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but she didn't take her eyes off the door. "Why does he know my name?" Richard exhaled sharply through his nose, his jaw tight. "Because he's been looking for you." Her stomach twisted painfully. "Why?" Richard didn't answer. That was all the confirmation she needed. Emily wrenched her arm free, stepping back. "No," she breathed. "No more secrets. No more waiting for you to decide what I deserve to know." Richard's eyes darkened. "Emily, listen to me." But she wasn't listening anymore. She turned on her heel and ran. Her bare feet barely made a sound against the wooden floor as she rushed toward the door. Every part of her screamed for her to stop, to think, to remember that Richard had locked her inside this house for a reason. But the voice outside called to her again. "Emily, open the door." And this time she did. The air outside was sharp and cold, sending a violent shiver down her spine as the door swung open. The storm had passed, but the sky was still heavy with dark clouds, the scent of rain thick in the air. And standing on the front porch was a man she had never seen before. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark hair peppered with gray. His eyes were sharp, piercing, scanning her face as if he had been searching for her his entire life. His mouth parted slightly, almost like he was in shock. "You really do look like her," he murmured. Emily stiffened. "Like who?" Behind her, Richard moved fast. His hand shot out, grabbing the edge of the door to slam it shut. But Alejandro was quicker. The man lunged forward, one foot stepping inside just as the door was about to close. His gaze locked onto Richard, something unreadable flashing across his face. "Richard," Alejandro said, his voice heavy with something like bitterness. "It's been a long time." Emily's chest tightened. They knew each other. Richard's expression darkened, his grip on the door tightening until his knuckles turned white. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice dangerously low. Alejandro's jaw twitched. "Neither should you." The tension between them was suffocating. A storm brewing right in front of her, swirling with unspoken history and unfinished business. Emily took a step back, her mind racing. "Someone talk to me," she demanded, her voice shaking. "What the hell is going on?" Alejandro's gaze flicked back to her, his features softening slightly. "I came here to tell you the truth," he said. "Something Richard has spent your entire life hiding from you." Her stomach twisted violently. Richard's voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. "She doesn't need to hear anything from you, because you don't want her to." Alejandro shot back, stepping fully inside now. Richard didn't move to stop him. "You've been lying to her, Richard, just like you lied to Margaret." Emily's breath hitched. Her mother's name, on Alejandro's lips. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She looked between them, her body stiff with tension. "How do you know my mom?" Alejandro hesitated. Then finally he exhaled. "Because I was there the night she left you." Emily's blood ran cold. "Left me." The words crashed into her like a violent wave, knocking the air from her lungs. "What?" she whispered. Richard's voice was firm. Don't listen to him. Alejandro ignored him. She was trying to protect you, Emily. Richard moved before he could finish. Not violently, not aggressively, but desperately. He grabbed Alejandro's arm, shoving him back toward the doorway. You don't get to come into my house and throw around your version of the truth, he snapped. You don't get to rewrite history. Alejandro's eyes burned with something fierce. That's exactly what you've been doing for 13 years. Emily felt like she couldn't breathe. She pressed a hand to her stomach, trying to ground herself, trying to stop the spinning world from tilting completely out of control. Somebody tell me what's going on, she pleaded. Now. Richard's expression was stone. You don't need to know. Alejandro's was softer. You deserve to know. Emily clenched her fists. She was done being ignored. Then tell me, she shouted, her voice shaking with anger, with frustration, with fear. Alejandro took a slow breath. Then, Richard is your father. Silence. Heavy. Deafening. Emily's ears rang. Her body went rigid. She shook her head, her brain rejecting the words, denying them because they didn't make sense, because they couldn't make sense. No, that wasn't true. But Richard wasn't denying it. He just stood there, still, silent, like he had been caught, like it was the truth. Emily's knees buckled. She grabbed the edge of the doorframe to keep herself upright, her breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. You're lying, she choked out. You're both lying. Alejandro shook his head. No, Emily, we're not. Her chest ached. Everything she had known, everything she had believed, it had all been a lie. She turned to Richard, her vision blurred with unshed tears. Tell me he's lying, she whispered. Richard's face was unreadable. His lips parted. And then, I can't. Emily felt something inside her shatter. Everything collapsed. Her entire life. A lie. She staggered back, the weight of it crushing her, pressing down, making it impossible to think, to breathe. And then, something else hit her. Something worse. If you're my father, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Why didn't my mom tell me? Richard's expression flickered with something. Pain. But it was Alejandro who answered. Because she was trying to protect you. Emily's heart pounded. From what? Alejandro's gaze darkened. And then, his answer came. Simple. Devastating. From him. Silence. Thick. Heavy. Emily turned to Richard, her breath caught in her throat. But this time, he didn't deny it. And that was the moment Emily realized. She had been running from the wrong monster all along. Emily felt like the ground beneath her had cracked open, splitting apart, leaving her standing on the edge of something vast and terrifying. The air inside the house had thickened, suffocating, pressing against her chest until she thought she might collapse under its weight. The truth, or at least a version of it, had been spoken. Richard Carter was her father, and her mother had spent her entire life hiding that fact. Her breath came in sharp, uneven bursts as she turned her gaze from Alejandro to Richard. Her stomach twisted painfully, nausea creeping up her throat. She felt like she was floating outside her own body, watching this unfold from a distance, unable to comprehend that this was her life. Richard wasn't speaking. He wasn't moving. He just stood there, his expression unreadable, his shoulders tense, his fingers curled into fists at his sides. That silence told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't denying it. Alejandro exhaled, watching her carefully. His eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name. Pity? Sympathy? Regret? She didn't want any of it. Emily's voice was barely a whisper. Tell me why. No one answered. She swallowed, forcing herself to breathe through the tightness in her chest. Tell me why she hid me from you. Still nothing. Her hands clenched at her sides. Say something. Richard finally blinked, exhaling slowly, his jaw tightening. His voice was low, almost too calm. It's complicated. Emily let out a hollow, bitter laugh. Complicated. Her voice rose, the anger she had been suppressing boiling over. I just found out that my entire life has been a lie. And that's all you have to say? Alejandro took a step forward, his gaze flicking to Richard. Emily, your mother. She didn't leave you out of cruelty. She was afraid. She thought she had no choice. Emily's chest ached. Afraid of what? Alejandro hesitated. Emily's hands trembled. Afraid of who? And then she turned back to Richard, her heartbeat thundering against her ribs. Was it you? Her voice cracked. Was she afraid of you? Richard's eyes darkened, and something inside him shifted. Alejandro was the one who answered. Yes. Emily took a step back, everything inside her screaming that this was wrong, that this couldn't be true. She looked at Richard again, searching for something, anything to contradict it. But he didn't speak. He didn't defend himself. And that silence destroyed her. Her vision blurred with unshed tears, and her chest felt like it was being crushed from the inside. What did you do? She whispered. Richard's hands twitched at his sides. Emily, but she didn't want to hear it. What did you do? She screamed, her entire body shaking. Richard flinched. Not much, just a tiny movement, almost imperceptible. But she saw it, and so did Alejandro. Alejandro's voice was firm. He made her choose, him or you, and she chose you. Emily's heart stopped. Her knees buckled, and she staggered back against the wall. No, she whispered. Yes, Alejandro said softly. Margaret left because she knew she couldn't stay. She knew she had to disappear. For your sake. Emily felt her world crumbling. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She pressed a hand to her chest, struggling to breathe, struggling to make sense of any of it. Richard finally moved. He took a step toward her, his voice softer than before. Emily, listen to me. But she shook her head violently. Don't, she choked out. Don't come near me. A flash of pain crossed his face. I never hurt her, he said. I never hurt you. Whatever she told you. She didn't tell me anything. Emily cut him off, her voice cracking. She never said a word about you. She let me believe you didn't exist. Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Because she knew if you found out, you'd come looking. Emily's breath caught. And what would have happened if I did? Silence. Thick, heavy, suffocating. Alejandro's voice was barely a whisper. She was afraid of what he'd do to you if you ever came back. Emily felt sick. She turned, her eyes burning, and before she could stop herself, she was running. Not out the front door. It was still blocked by Alejandro and Richard. Instead, she bolted toward the staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time, her lungs burning. She needed to get away. She needed space. She needed to think. Her feet pounded against the wooden floor as she reached her bedroom, slamming the door behind her. She locked it. Then she backed away. 1 step, 2, until her back hit the wall and her legs gave out beneath her. She curled in on herself, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her forehead. This isn't happening. This isn't real. But it was. Every horrible, twisted thing she had just learned. It was all real. Richard was her father. Her mother had been running from him. And Alejandro, her breath caught. Who was Alejandro? He had known her mother. He had known Richard. He had been there when her mother disappeared. But who was he to her? Her mind raced, putting together fragments of memories, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even realized existed. And then it hit her. The dreams, the voice in her nightmares, the whisper of a name. Alejandro, she gasped, her hands clutching her head. She had known him before, not in this life, not in her memories, but somewhere, deep inside her, she had always known his name. And that realization sent a new wave of terror crashing through her. Because if Alejandro had been a part of her past, then why couldn't she remember him? A knock at the door made her flinch. Emily? Richard's voice came from the other side, cautious, careful. Please open the door. She pressed herself tighter against the wall, her breath unsteady. I know you're upset, he continued, but we need to talk. Emily squeezed her eyes shut. No, she couldn't talk. Not now. Not to him. Another knock. This time Alejandro's voice. Emily, I know this is a lot. I know you're scared. But please listen to me. Emily clenched her fists. Why? She whispered, barely loud enough for them to hear. A pause. Then Alejandro said the words that sent a chill down her spine. Because your mother didn't just leave to protect you. Emily's heartbeat slowed. Alejandro's voice was softer now. She left because someone was looking for you. And she knew. If they found you, they'd take you away. Emily's stomach twisted painfully. Her voice shook. Who? Silence. Then, finally, Alejandro whispered, Hector Ramirez. Emily's entire body went rigid. Her breath hitched. The name, it meant nothing to her. And yet, she had never been more afraid in her life. And deep down, she knew. Her past had finally caught up with her. And this was only the beginning. Emily sat frozen, her back pressed against the cold wooden floor of her bedroom. Her knees pulled tightly against her chest. Her heart pounded so hard that she could hear it in her ears. A relentless, deafening rhythm that drowned out everything else. The name Alejandro had spoken hung in the air like an unshakable shadow. Hector Ramirez. She whispered it under her breath, rolling the unfamiliar syllables on her tongue, trying to make sense of why it sent a shiver down her spine. She had never heard that name before, and yet, somewhere deep inside her, she knew it meant something. On the other side of the door, Richard and Alejandro were silent, waiting, watching. Then Richard spoke, his voice strained, controlled. Emily, open the door. She didn't move. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips, in her temples, in the back of her throat. No, a heavy sigh. Emily, who is Hector Ramirez? She cut him off, her voice sharp, trembling. Silence. Then Alejandro said, Your mother was hiding you from him. Emily's stomach twisted. Her breath hitched, her fingers digging into her arms. Why? Richard's voice was low. Because he wanted to take you away from her. The words sent a jolt of terror through her, cold and suffocating. Take me? Why? That doesn't make sense, she whispered. That doesn't make any sense. Alejandro's voice was softer now. I know it doesn't, but it will. Emily clenched her fists, her nails biting into her palms. I want the truth. Another pause. Then Richard said, Not here. Emily swallowed hard. The weight of everything. The locked doors, the hidden past, the unanswered questions, pressed down on her like a suffocating fog. And then she realized something. If you wanted me to know the truth, she whispered, why did you lock me inside this house? The silence that followed was loud enough to drown out the world. Emily's hands trembled. You didn't want me to find out, did you? Richard exhaled, and for the first time, she heard something raw in his voice. Defeat. It's not that simple. Emily's eyes burned. Then make it simple. Another pause. Then finally, the lock clicked. The door cracked open an inch. Emily's breath hitched as she looked up, seeing Richard's face through the gap, shadowed and unreadable. Come downstairs, he said. We'll talk. Emily hesitated. Every instinct told her not to trust him, to run, to get out. But where would she go? She swallowed hard, then slowly, cautiously, rose to her feet. She didn't say a word as she stepped forward, pushing the door open all the way. Alejandro stood a few feet behind Richard, his arms crossed, his gaze heavy. Richard stepped aside, motioning toward the staircase. Emily inhaled sharply, forcing her legs to move, forcing herself to descend the steps one at a time, Alejandro and Richard close behind. When they reached the living room, Richard gestured for her to sit. She didn't. Talk, she said instead, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Richard exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Then he turned to Alejandro. You wanted to tell her? Then tell her. Alejandro's jaw tightened. He turned to Emily, his expression unreadable. Then finally, Hector Ramirez is your grandfather. Emily stared. Her mind blanked. Her mouth parted slightly, but no words came. Then she laughed. A short, disbelieving laugh. That's not. She shook her head, taking a step back. That's not possible. Alejandro's gaze was steady. It is. Emily felt like she had been punched in the gut. You're lying. Richard's voice was quiet. No, he's not. Emily snapped. Stop lying to me, she shouted. Her voice raw, breaking, filled with rage and grief and fear. Neither of them moved. Neither of them denied it. And that silence destroyed her. Emily's breath hitched, her body trembling as she wrapped her arms around herself. You're telling me my whole life I had a grandfather out there? Someone my mother was hiding from? And neither of you thought to tell me. Alejandro exhaled. It wasn't safe. Emily's head snapped up. Safe? She whispered. Why? Richard and Alejandro exchanged a look. Then Richard said, because Hector Ramirez is a very powerful man, and your mother didn't want him to find you. Emily's blood ran cold. She took a step back, shaking her head. Why? Alejandro's voice was barely above a whisper. Because if he found you, he would have taken you away from her. Emily's stomach twisted. Her chest felt tight. Her fingers curled into fists as she whispered, Why? Richard's voice was flat. Because he believed you belonged to him. Emily's knees nearly buckled. What? Alejandro exhaled. Hector tried to take you away from your mother when you were a baby. He tried to claim custody. He tried to. Emily pressed a hand to her forehead. That doesn't make sense. Why would he think? And then it hit her, like a violent, sickening realization that knocked the air from her lungs. She looked up, her eyes wide with horror. He thinks I'm his daughter. Silence. Richard's lips parted slightly. Alejandro exhaled sharply, but neither of them denied it. Emily's stomach churned. A chill crawled down her spine. She shook her head slowly, violently. That's not true. Richard's voice was strained. No, it's not. But he thinks it is, Alejandro said. Emily felt sick. Alejandro's voice softened. Your mother. She never told him the truth. She let him believe it because it was the only way to keep you safe. If he knew you were Richard's. He hesitated, exhaling. He wouldn't have let her leave. Emily's knees gave out. She collapsed onto the couch, her hands clutching her head, her entire world shattering. All this time, her mother had been lying to keep her safe. Hector Ramirez had been searching for her for 13 years, believing she was his daughter. And now he knew where she was. Emily's breath came in short, sharp gasps, panic closing in. Her vision blurred. The walls pressed in. The air turned thick and suffocating. And then, a knock at the door. Not hesitant, not polite, loud, forceful, demanding. Emily's blood turned to ice. She turned her wide, terrified eyes toward Richard. His expression was grim. The knocking came again. Then, a voice. A deep, commanding voice that sent pure terror down Emily's spine. Emily Carter. A pause. Then, it's time to come home. Emily's breath hitched. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. She could only stare at the door, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Because she knew. Hector Ramirez had found her. And now, everything was about to change. Emily's breath came in short, shallow gasps as the knock at the door sent a sharp chill down her spine. The voice, that voice, was deep, steady, and filled with an authority that made her stomach churn with dread. The weight of the words settled in her chest like a stone, heavy and unshakable. Emily Carter, it's time to come home. No. Her hands trembled as she dug her nails into the couch, grounding herself, trying to convince herself that she was still in control, that this wasn't happening. But deep down, she knew. Everything had just changed. The silence in the room was suffocating. Richard and Alejandro stood frozen, their bodies tense, their faces carved from stone. Richard's jaw was locked so tightly it looked like his teeth might shatter. His hands curled into fists at his sides. Alejandro's gaze flickered between Emily and the door, his expression grim, calculating. Then the knock came again, louder, more impatient. Emily flinched. Alejandro moved first, "Stay here," he ordered, his voice low, firm, before turning and striding toward the door. Richard grabbed his arm before he could reach it. "Don't open it." Alejandro yanked his arm free. "If we don't, he's going to break it down." Richard's eyes burned. "Let him try." But then, before either of them could react, the voice came again. "I know she's in there. Open the door, or I make a call you won't like." Emily's stomach twisted. A call? To who? Her pulse pounded so loudly she barely registered Alejandro muttering a curse before unlocking the door. The door creaked open, revealing him. Hector Ramirez, tall, broad-shouldered, imposing in a way that made the air feel heavier. His dark suit was pristine, expensive, tailored to perfection. But it was his eyes that unsettled her the most, sharp, calculating, assessing her like she was an investment rather than a person. Emily's breath caught in her throat. He was looking directly at her. A slow, almost knowing smile curved his lips. "There you are." Every muscle in her body screamed run. But she couldn't. She was frozen, trapped in the weight of his gaze, in the certainty that he had been searching for her for years. Hector stepped inside, his movements fluid, deliberate. Richard tensed immediately, stepping forward, his broad frame blocking Emily from view. "You're not welcome here." Hector barely acknowledged him. His eyes stayed on Emily. "You've grown." His voice was smooth, disturbingly calm, as if they were old friends. "You look just like her." Emily's stomach twisted. Just like who? Her mother? Or the daughter he thought he lost? Her lips parted, her mind spinning, trying to form words, but Alejandro spoke first. "She's not going anywhere with you." Hector turned his gaze to Alejandro, arching a brow. "Ah, Alejandro, still playing bodyguard." Alejandro's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Hector exhaled, shaking his head. "You always did like making things complicated." Then, as if he hadn't just thrown a loaded insult, he turned his attention back to Emily. "I know you're confused," he said gently, taking a slow step forward. "I know this is a lot, but I've been looking for you for a long time." Emily stiffened. "Why?" Hector tilted his head slightly, his sharp eyes studying her. "Because I thought you were dead." Silence. Heavy. Cold. Emily's heart stopped. She blinked, her mind stuttering, shutting down, rejecting the words. "What?" she whispered. Hector sighed, his expression unreadable. "Your mother took you away from me. I searched for years, but I was told she didn't make it, that you didn't make it." Emily felt like she couldn't breathe. Richard's voice was low, dangerous. "And you believed that?" Hector's lips pressed into a thin line. "I didn't want to, but I had no reason to think otherwise." He exhaled sharply. "Until recently." Emily's hands shook. "How did you find me?" Hector's gaze flickered toward Richard. "He made a mistake." Richard stiffened. Emily turned toward him, her pulse roaring. "What does he mean?" Richard didn't speak. Alejandro's voice was flat. "He means Richard tried to bury the past. But some things don't stay buried." Emily's breath hitched. Her gaze snapped back to Hector. "If you thought I was dead, why are you here now?" Hector's expression softened, as if he actually thought he could pretend to be gentle. "Because I want to take care of you, the way I should have." A chill ran down Emily's spine. She took a step back. "I don't even know you." Hector's smile faltered, just for a second, before he recovered. "That's not your fault. Or mine. It's hers." Emily's chest tightened. "Don't talk about my mom like that." Hector's gaze darkened slightly. "She lied to you, to me, to everyone. And now you have to ask yourself, Emily, if she was willing to lie about who your father was, what else was she hiding?" The words hit her like a hammer, because they were too close to the questions she had been asking herself. She shook her head, trying to push it away, trying to hold on to what she knew. But what did she actually know? Her mother had run. Her mother had lied. And now she had a grandfather she never knew existed, standing in front of her, acting like he cared. Emily swallowed hard. "What do you want from me?" Hector exhaled, softening his posture. Just to get to know you. Richard's voice was sharp. She's not going anywhere with you. Hector turned to him, his expression cool, unbothered. That's not your choice to make. Alejandro stepped forward. Actually, it is. Richard is her legal guardian. Hector smirked. For now. Emily's stomach dropped. Hector's voice was smooth, assured. I have lawyers, Alejandro. I have resources. You really think a court won't reconsider guardianship once they hear the truth? Emily felt sick. He was going to fight for custody. He was going to take her away. Her breath came in short, uneven bursts. I don't want to go with you, she whispered. Hector's eyes softened. You don't have to decide now. She clenched her fists. I already did. Hector sighed. I'll be back. The certainty in his voice sent another wave of terror through her. Because she knew this wasn't over. Hector Ramirez had found her. And now he wasn't going to stop. As he turned to leave, he glanced back one last time. You can't hide her forever, Richard. Then, with that final warning, he walked out. The door clicked shut behind him. And Emily knew her life would never be the same again. The door clicked shut, but the weight of Hector Ramirez's presence remained in the room like a shadow that refused to fade. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing down on Emily's chest as she stood there, her mind spinning, unraveling, coming apart at the seams. She could still hear his voice. You can't hide her forever, Richard. The certainty in his tone sent a violent shiver down her spine, because she knew he meant it. Hector had come here with a purpose. He had found her. He had looked her in the eye, had claimed her as his own. And now he wasn't going to stop. Her stomach twisted. A part of her had been desperate to believe this was all some horrible misunderstanding, that Hector was just another thread in the tangled mess of lies surrounding her past. But the way he had looked at her, it was like he already owned her, like he was simply waiting to take back what he thought was his. Emily shook her head violently, trying to push the thought away, trying to force herself to breathe. Across the room, Richard was still standing rigid, his fists clenched so tightly at his sides that his knuckles had turned white. His entire body was tense, coiled with barely restrained fury. Alejandro, on the other hand, was calmer. Too calm. His arms were crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable as he watched Richard with a careful, assessing gaze. And then he spoke. You should have told her. Richard's head snapped toward him, his eyes dark. And what would that have changed? Alejandro let out a slow breath, shaking his head. Everything. Emily felt like screaming. Her voice came out sharp, raw. Told me what? Richard turned to her, his jaw tightening. Alejandro beat him to it. That this was inevitable. Emily's stomach dropped. Alejandro's voice was steady. That no matter how much he tried to keep you hidden, no matter how many lies were told to protect you, Hector was always going to find you. Emily's pulse pounded so loudly she could barely hear herself speak. How? Alejandro exhaled. Because he never stopped looking. Emily's breath hitched. Alejandro's eyes were dark, filled with something heavy, final. Because he knew you existed, even when you didn't know about him. She felt sick. A sharp, suffocating pressure settled in her chest. That doesn't make sense. Richard let out a bitter, hollow laugh. None of this does. Emily ignored him. Her gaze was locked on Alejandro. How long? Alejandro hesitated. Then, since the moment your mother disappeared. Emily's knees nearly gave out. 13 years. He had been searching for her for 13 years. She pressed a trembling hand to her forehead, her mind racing, spinning out of control. Why had he never stopped? Why had her mother gone to such desperate lengths to keep her away from him? And the worst part, the part she could barely let herself think. What would have happened if he had found her sooner? Her stomach churned violently. She felt like she was going to be sick. Richard finally spoke, his voice flat. He's not getting her. Alejandro turned to him, his expression unreadable. That's not your decision to make anymore. The words hit like a slap. Richard's entire body tensed, his hands curling into fists again. Like hell it isn't. Alejandro didn't flinch. He's going to fight for her, Richard. You know that. Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. He can try. Emily clenched her fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface, rising, threatening to spill over. She had spent her entire life believing she was free, believing that, no matter how hard things got, at least she had been given the chance to choose her own path. And now she was just a piece in someone else's game, a thing to be claimed, a pawn to be fought over. She refused to let that happen. She took a step forward, her voice sharp, shaking. I'm not a prize to be won. Both men turned to her. She lifted her chin, ignoring the way her chest ached. I don't belong to either of you. Richard's expression flickered with something. Pain, regret, something deeper, something he wasn't saying. Alejandro just exhaled, shaking his head. You don't understand, Emily. Emily snapped. Then make me understand. The words echoed through the room. And then Richard spoke. His voice was rough, almost reluctant. Because Hector thinks you're his daughter. Silence. Emily felt her entire world tilt. Her breath hitched violently, her hands shaking. She had already heard it before. She had already been told this. But somehow, hearing it now, hearing it from Richard, felt like a new kind of devastation. Richard's voice was quieter now. And the only reason he's still fighting for you is because he doesn't know the truth. Emily swallowed hard. The truth. Alejandro's gaze was sharp. That you're Richard's daughter, not his. Emily's stomach twisted. The weight of it, the truth, the lies, the decisions that had been made for her. It was too much. Alejandro's voice was softer now. Your mother never told him. She never told anyone. Emily's fingers curled into fists. Why? Richard let out a slow breath, and when he finally met her eyes, there was something raw, broken, desperate in his expression. And then he said it. Because she knew he would never let you go. Emily's vision blurred. The room spun. Everything, the secrets, the half-truths, the years of running, it all led back to this. To him. To Hector Ramirez. And now that he had found her, he wasn't going to stop. Emily sucked in a sharp breath, forcing herself to stay upright. Her voice was quieter now, deadlier. What happens now? Alejandro hesitated. Richard turned away. And that silence, that horrible, suffocating silence, told her everything she needed to know. Because the truth was, no one knew. No one knew how to stop him. No one knew how to keep her safe. And now, she was running out of time. Emily sat motionless, staring at the floor, her mind caught in a relentless spiral of thoughts she couldn't control. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, pressing against her chest like an invisible force trying to break her. Every word spoken in the last few hours echoed inside her skull, each one laced with a deeper, more terrifying truth. Hector Ramirez thought she was his daughter. He had spent 13 years searching for her, convinced that her mother had stolen her away, and now he had found her. Emily clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms so hard she thought she might draw blood. How had this happened? How had her entire life turned into a story that didn't belong to her? Across the room, Richard stood by the window, his shoulders stiff, his hands gripping the windowsill as if he were bracing himself for something inevitable. Alejandro remained near the door, arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. They were waiting for her to process what had just happened, waiting for her to decide who she believed. But she didn't know. She didn't know anything anymore. Finally, she spoke, her voice hoarse. What happens now? Richard exhaled sharply, his grip on the windowsill tightening. We wait. Emily frowned, her stomach twisting. For what? Alejandro's voice was calm but firm. For his next move. His next move. Emily's blood ran cold. The way Alejandro said it, so certain, so absolute, told her everything she needed to know. Hector wasn't finished. This wasn't over. Emily swallowed hard, her throat tight. What if he takes this to court? What if he... She stopped, not wanting to finish the thought, not wanting to say it aloud. Alejandro studied her, his gaze heavy. Then we fight him. Richard finally turned from the window, his expression dark. No. We end this before it gets that far. Emily's breath caught. How? Richard didn't answer right away. His eyes flickered toward Alejandro, something unspoken passing between them. Alejandro exhaled. We tell him the truth. Silence. Richard's jaw tightened. That's not an option. Alejandro arched a brow. So what's your plan? Hide her in this house forever. Richard's silence was all the confirmation she needed. Emily stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. No. Both men turned to her. Her hands trembled at her sides, her voice sharp, unwavering. I won't spend the rest of my life running from a man I don't even know. Richard's expression darkened. You don't understand what he's capable of. Emily's chest tightened. Then make me understand. Richard looked away, exhaling slowly. Alejandro sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Emily, enough, she snapped. I'm done with the secrets. I deserve to know what's coming for me. Richard was silent for a long time. Then finally he spoke. His voice was low, controlled. Hector isn't just some man who lost his daughter. He's powerful, dangerous. He has connections that go far beyond what you can imagine. Emily's pulse pounded. What does that mean? Alejandro's voice was sharp. It means he won't stop until he gets what he wants. Emily's stomach twisted. And what does he want? Richard's answer was simple. You. The word hit her like a hammer to the chest. Emily took a shaky step back, her mind racing, unraveling, drowning. She had spent her entire life believing she was just a normal girl. That, despite everything, she had a choice in her own life. But now she was nothing more than a prize in someone else's fight. Possession. Acclaim. Emily clenched her fists. What if I don't let him take me? Alejandro's jaw tightened. Then he'll take everything else instead. A chill crawled down her spine. Richard's voice was quieter now, but just as heavy. That's why your mother ran. Emily swallowed hard. Her mother had known. She had known that Hector would never let her go. That no matter where they ran, he would always find them. And now he had. Emily took a shaky breath. So what do I do? Neither man answered. Because the truth was, there was no right answer. No matter what she chose, she would lose. Her breath hitched. I won't let him win. Richard's expression flickered with something. Pride, fear, something deeper. Alejandro exhaled. Then you have to be ready. Emily's pulse pounded. For what? Alejandro's gaze was sharp. For war. And then, a knock at the door. Loud, demanding. Emily's stomach dropped. She turned, her breath catching in her throat. Richard's entire body went rigid. Alejandro's hand moved toward the gun he wasn't supposed to have. The knocking came again. Then, a voice. Cold, commanding, unshakable. Emily Carter. She knew that voice. She had heard it before. Through the door. In her nightmares. In the shadows of her past she didn't even remember. It was him. It was Hector Ramirez. Emily's blood turned to ice. Richard's voice was barely a whisper. Don't open it. But Emily wasn't sure she had a choice anymore. Because deep down, she knew. This was it. Everything was about to change. And there was no turning back. The knock came again. Louder this time. More forceful. More certain. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest. Her pulse pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. Hector Ramirez was on the other side of that door. Waiting. Watching. Ready to take her away. Richard didn't move. Alejandro stood rigid, his muscles tense. His body positioned between Emily and the door. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Then Hector spoke. I know you're in there, Emily. Emily's hands shook. Richard's jaw clenched, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. His entire body screamed violence, an unspoken warning that he could not let this happen. Alejandro exhaled slowly, his eyes never leaving the door. We don't have to do this now. Hector let out a low chuckle. Oh, but we do. Emily's stomach twisted. She could hear it in his voice. The confidence. The certainty. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't a request. He had already decided how this was going to end. And she was the only one left without a choice. Richard took a step forward, his voice low and sharp. "Leave." Hector sighed, almost as if he were disappointed. "That's not how this works." Richard's fists tightened. "You have no right." "I have every right." The words cut through the air like a blade. Emily flinched. Hector's voice remained steady, unwavering. "She's my blood, my family, and I have every right to be here." Alejandro's voice was cold. "She's not yours." A long silence followed. Then, softly, too softly, Hector spoke again. "Are you sure about that?" Emily's breath hitched. The question sent a violent shiver down her spine. Because she didn't know. She didn't know what was true anymore. She had spent her entire life believing one thing, only to be told it was a lie. So what if there was more? What if there was another lie waiting to unravel? Alejandro moved first. He turned to Emily, his eyes dark, serious. "You don't have to do this." But Emily didn't move, because deep down she knew. She had to do this. She had to face him. She had to know. So she took a step forward. And then another. Richard's voice was sharp, filled with panic. "Emily, don't." But she was already reaching for the door. Her fingers trembled against the handle. She took a slow breath, and then she pulled it open. The cold night air hit her first. A sharp, biting chill that wrapped around her skin and sent a violent shiver down her spine. And then him. Hector Ramirez stood tall, his dark suit crisp and perfectly pressed, his presence filling the space around him like a storm that had been brewing for years. His eyes met hers, and then he smiled. Emily's stomach dropped. The way he looked at her, it was like she had already been claimed, like she had been his from the very beginning, like she had always belonged to him. Her breath shook. "There you are," Hector murmured. "I've waited a long time for this moment." Emily felt sick. Richard moved to step in front of her, but Hector lifted a hand. "Enough." The word was calm, controlled, and somehow more dangerous than anything else. Richard's entire body tensed. Hector's eyes never left Emily's. "You have your mother's eyes." A sharp pain stabbed through Emily's chest. She hated the way he said it, as if he had the right, as if he knew her mother, as if he deserved to say her name. Her fingers curled into fists. "You don't know anything about her." Hector's lips twitched. "Don't I?" Emily's pulse pounded. Hector tilted his head slightly, studying her. "She ran from me, Emily, took you away, disappeared in the middle of the night like a coward." Emily's breath caught. "She wasn't a coward." Hector's eyes darkened. "She was a liar." Emily felt something inside her snap. "She was protecting me." Hector let out a low laugh, shaking his head. "Is that what she told you?" Emily's stomach twisted. Because it was. It was exactly what she had been told. And yet, why did it feel like a trap? Why did it feel like Hector was leading her towards something she wasn't ready to hear? Her voice was sharp, filled with something dangerously close to desperation. She had a reason. Hector's expression softened, and for some reason, that terrified her more than anything else. "Oh, sweetheart." Emily's breath hitched. What if she was running from the wrong person? The words shattered her. Emily staggered back. Richard's voice was like a knife. "That's enough." Hector barely acknowledged him. His gaze was locked onto Emily's, his voice lower now. "She lied to you, Emily." Emily shook her head violently. "No." But Hector took another step forward. And then he whispered it. "What if I was never the one she was afraid of?" Emily froze. Her heart stopped. Everything stopped. Richard's entire body went rigid. Alejandro's expression darkened. But Emily couldn't move. Because suddenly, everything was different. Hector exhaled slowly, watching her carefully. And then, he said the words that changed everything. "She wasn't running from me." Silence. Emily felt like she was falling, like the floor had vanished beneath her feet. Hector's voice was calm. She was running from Richard. Emily's breath caught. Her hands shook. Her stomach twisted violently. She turned to Richard, her vision blurred with panic, with fear, with something she couldn't even name. And then, she saw it. The truth. The thing she had been too afraid to see before. Richard wasn't denying it. He was just standing there, silent, still, like a man who had just been caught. Emily's blood ran cold. And for the first time, the very first time, she wondered if she had spent her entire life running from the wrong monster. Emily's mind was unraveling. She felt everything and nothing at the same time, like she was trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The words still echoed in her head, sharp and cutting, tearing through everything she had believed to be true. She was running from Richard. Her breath caught, her body trembling, but she couldn't move. Richard was still standing there, silent, watching, and he wasn't denying it. That silence was worse than anything else. It was confirmation. It was truth. Emily staggered back, her chest tight, her fingers curling into fists as she turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Say something." Richard's jaw clenched, his face carved from stone. But he didn't speak. He just stood there. Emily's stomach twisted violently. "Tell me he's lying." Still nothing. The room was too quiet, too heavy, too thick with a truth she wasn't ready for. Richard exhaled slowly, his hands curling into fists at his sides. His entire body was rigid, a coiled spring ready to snap. Then, finally, "It's not that simple." Emily's blood ran cold. She took another step back, her vision blurring, spinning, breaking. "It is that simple," she choked out. "Either you were the man she was running from or you weren't." Richard's silence shattered her. Hector exhaled, his voice low. "Now do you understand?" Emily turned to him, her pulse roaring in her ears. She didn't want to believe him. She didn't want to believe any of this. But Richard's silence, his refusal to fight back, it was louder than any confession. Emily swallowed hard, her throat raw, her chest tight. Her voice was barely a whisper. "What did you do?" Richard flinched. That small, almost imperceptible movement made her stomach churn. Because it was the first time she had seen him hesitate. The first time she had seen fear in his expression. And that terrified her more than anything. Alejandro exhaled, stepping forward. "Emily, we need to leave." But Emily couldn't move. She couldn't do anything. Because suddenly the walls were closing in. The house felt smaller. The air thick, suffocating, poisoned with truths that had been buried for too long. Richard's voice was hoarse. "You don't understand." Emily's breath hitched. "Then make me understand." Richard's eyes darkened. And then, finally, he spoke. "Your mother was going to take you from me." The words hit her like a hammer to the chest. Emily staggered back, her entire body trembling. Her voice cracked. "Because she was afraid of you?" Richard flinched again. That was all the answer she needed. Emily felt like she was falling, drowning, collapsing. Richard's voice was low, rough. She was wrong. Emily's stomach twisted. Then why did she run? Richard's eyes flashed. Because Hector gave her a reason to. Silence. Emily's pulse pounded. What? Richard took a slow breath. Hector gave her an ultimatum. She had two choices. Give you to him or run. Emily's blood turned to ice. She turned to Hector, her breath shaking. Is that true? Hector's jaw tightened. Then, yes. Emily's vision blurred. Her mother had been forced to choose, to run or lose her forever, and she had chosen to run. Emily's heart ached, twisted, broke, because she had spent so long thinking she had been abandoned. But the truth was worse. She had been hunted. Richard exhaled. She never should have trusted him. She never should have believed he would just let her go. Hector let out a sharp, bitter laugh. You still don't get it, do you? Richard's entire body tensed. Get what? Hector's eyes darkened. She wasn't just running from me. She was running from you, too. Richard froze. Emily felt something inside her shatter. Hector's voice was softer now. You made her choose to. Emily's breath hitched. Because he was right. Her mother had run from both of them, because neither of them had been safe. Neither of them had been a choice she could live with, and that realization destroyed her. Emily wrapped her arms around herself, her body shaking violently. "Then who am I supposed to trust?" she whispered. No one answered, because they all knew the truth. There was no one left to trust. She was alone, completely, utterly alone. Alejandro's voice was gentle. "Emily, we have to go." But Emily didn't move, because deep down she knew. She knew that no matter where she ran, no matter what choice she made, she would never be free. Her past would always catch up to her. And there was only one way to end this. One choice left. One truth that could set her free. Her breath shook. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Tell me the truth, Richard." He met her eyes, and for the first time, she saw it. The truth. Raw. Unforgiving. Real. Richard's voice was hoarse. "I did what I had to do." Emily's stomach twisted. "What does that mean?" Richard exhaled. And then he said the words that changed everything. "I never planned to let her take you." Emily's chest tightened painfully. She felt like she was breaking, shattering, disappearing, because suddenly everything made sense. The fear in her mother's eyes, the desperate way she had run, the reason she had never come back. She had known. She had known that Richard wasn't going to let her leave. Emily took a slow, shaking breath, and then she turned, without a word, without looking back, and she walked toward the door. Richard's voice was sharp, panicked. "Emily!" She stopped. She didn't turn around. She didn't say anything, because for the first time in her life, she finally understood. She had been running from the wrong person all along, and now she knew exactly what she had to do. Emily walked, one step, then another. She didn't turn back, didn't look at Richard, didn't look at Hector. She just walked. Her breath was uneven, sharp, every inhale burning her lungs like she had been holding her breath for years. The air around her felt thick, suffocating, poisoned by everything that had just unraveled. Richard had never planned to let her mother leave. Her mother had been running from him just as much as she had been running from Hector. And all this time, Emily had been blind. She clenched her fists. Not anymore. Alejandro moved quickly, stepping beside her, his voice low, urgent. "Emily, we need to go." She didn't respond. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew that she couldn't stay. The house behind her, the place she had been forced to call home, was a prison, a trap, a lie. And Richard, Emily's stomach twisted painfully. She had spent weeks trying to understand him, trying to figure out if he was a monster or a man who had simply made mistakes. But now she knew. He was both. The sound of footsteps behind her made her chest tighten. Richard was following. "Emily!" Her steps quickened. "Emily, stop!" Her breath hitched, but she didn't. She couldn't. Alejandro's voice was sharp. "Back off, Richard." Richard ignored him. His voice was raw, desperate. "Don't do this. You don't understand." Emily's hands shook. She turned fast, sharp, furious. Her voice was hoarse, broken. "Then make me understand." Richard froze. Emily took a step forward, closing the distance between them. Her entire body was trembling, her chest aching, burning, tearing itself apart. "Tell me why," she whispered. "Tell me why you didn't let her go." Richard exhaled slowly, his gaze dark, unreadable. "Because I couldn't." Emily's stomach twisted. "Why?" Richard's fingers twitched at his sides. "Because she was taking you from me." Emily's breath caught. "I wasn't yours to take." The words hung between them like a blade. Richard's expression flickered. "You don't understand. She was my mother." Emily's voice shook. "And she was trying to protect me from you." Richard's jaw clenched. Emily let out a bitter, hollow laugh. "And the worst part? I still don't know what she was protecting me from." Richard's expression darkened. "I never hurt you." Emily's chest ached. "But you hurt her." Silence. Heavy. Cold. And then, softly, "I loved her." Emily's stomach turned. Richard's voice was quieter now. She was everything to me. Emily's hands shook, because she recognized that tone. She had heard it before, from Hector. She swallowed hard. Love isn't possession. Richard's lips parted slightly, but no words came, because he knew. He knew she was right. Alejandro exhaled, his voice firm. It's over, Richard. Richard's jaw tightened. She's not going with him. Alejandro didn't move. That's not your choice. Richard's eyes burned. You really think he's better than me? Emily's breath caught, and suddenly everything changed, because Richard was right about one thing. Hector wasn't better. Hector had hunted her for years, had wanted to own her, had lied, manipulated, waited, and now here he was. Emily turned, her gaze locking onto Hector's. He stood at the bottom of the steps, watching, always watching. His expression was calm, too calm. Emily took a slow breath, forcing her voice to stay steady. What do you really want from me? Hector tilted his head slightly. The truth. Emily's pulse pounded. You think you can own me? Hector sighed. No, I think you've been lied to, and I think you deserve to know everything. Emily hesitated, because deep down she knew he wasn't wrong. She had been lied to, by Richard, by her mother, by everyone. Alejandro's voice was low. You don't owe him anything. Emily's breath shook. She looked at Richard, then at Hector. One had spent his life chasing her. The other had spent his life keeping her trapped. Neither of them were safe. Neither of them were her answer. She inhaled sharply, her chest aching. And then she made her choice. She turned and walked past them both. Not toward Richard, not toward Hector, but away. Hector exhaled. Where do you think you're going? Emily didn't stop. Somewhere neither of you can follow. Hector let out a low, sharp laugh. And where is that? Emily lifted her chin. Her voice was steady, unwavering. The truth. Hector's smile faded. Richard took a slow step forward. Emily. She didn't turn around. She didn't look back. Because for the first time in her life, she was choosing herself. Not Richard, not Hector, not the war between them, just her. And as she stepped into the night, leaving the house, the lies, the past, behind her, she realized something. She had spent her life being chased, being trapped, being told who she was supposed to be. But now, for the first time, she was free.